Event will now begin.
Good morning to our friends joining us in the United States. Good afternoon to our participants from Europe, and hello to everyone else. My name is Saeed Ganji. I'm the President and Chairman of the National Union for Democracy in Iran. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual forum series that we have. As you know, NUFDI is a nonpartisan, non-profit organization of Iranian American based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to supporting the cause of human rights, freedom, and democracy in Iran. The situation in Iran grows more serious by the day, and the Iranian people, of course, being stifled by the Islamic Republic, look to those of us abroad to share their demands and struggle with the world. We are launching these series of conferences in effort to do our part to discuss these crucial topics. Today's topic, Islamic Republic's regional threat to regional peace and progress, arises out of the Islamic Republic's well-established and undisputed track record of meddling in the domestic affair of other countries and sponsoring terrorism worldwide. On behalf of NUFDI, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today to discuss this important topic, and would like to extend my special gratitude to our panel of experts. Our panelists today are Mr. Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council, Dr. Michael Doran of Hudson Institute, and of course, Mr. Alex Vatanka of MEI was supposed to be here, but some family emergency came up, so he, apologized for not being here, which I'm sure Michael and Ilan can simply fill in for him. We're also grateful to both the gentlemen for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And of course, now I would like to ask our policy director, Mr. Cameron Consarnio, to moderate today's panel. Thanks to Cameron, and please, Cameron, take it away.
Angie, for your leadership of NUFDI and for joining us this morning to introduce the event. I'd like to reiterate my thanks to everyone for joining and start briefly with some housekeeping notes for our guests, for those of us joining in this webinar. Please ask your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. If you're in the Zoom conference with us today, as I'm seeing many of you are, please use the Q&A function. There is a separate chat function. Please use that if you have any technical problems and we can try and assist you. But for questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function and I will be taking note of those throughout the event. And once the moderated Q&A session has finished, I will get to audience questions. If you're joining us on YouTube Live or other means, please ask your question in the comments section or using the hashtag NUFDI Forum on social media. Given that it's on YouTube Live, I should also add that this event is being recorded and it will be displayed later on YouTube as well. In Iran, as Dr. Ganji mentioned, has for 40 years, from its ascension to power by brute force during the Islamic Revolution, maintained many aspects of its revolutionary nature. Its courts are revolutionary courts, its guards are the infamous Revolutionary Guards, and it has a foreign policy that has remained as it was defined by Ruhollah Khomeini as, quote, exporting the revolution. What the Islamic Republic calls the exportation of the revolution, however, the people of Iran call an un-Iranian and anti-Iranian charade to distract from the regime's nearly dissolved support at home, and the people of the region call an imperialist policy hell-bent on establishing a Shiite caliphate that has left hundreds of thousands of people in its wake. How has the Islamic Republic worked against peace and progress in the region, and what does that hold for the future of each? Today, we have the distinct pleasure of being joined by two distinguished panelists who are leading experts on this topic here in Washington, and we're thankful for them joining us today. Ilan Berman is the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council here in Washington. He's an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He has consulted for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, as well as the Departments of State and Defense, and has provided assistance on foreign policy and national security issues to a range of governmental agencies and congressional offices. He has been called one of America's leading experts on the Middle East and Iran by CNN. Mr. Berman is a member of the Associated Faculty at Missouri State University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. A frequent writer and commentator, he has written for the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, USA Today, and many other publications. Mr. Berman is the editor and author of nearly a dozen books on US foreign policy and the Middle East. Dr. Michael Doran is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, where he specializes in Middle East security issues. In the administration of President George W. Bush, Dr. Doran served in the White House as a senior director in the National Security Council, where he was responsible for helping to devise and coordinate the US strategies on a variety of Middle East issues, including the Arab-Israeli relations and US efforts to contain Iran and Syria. He also served in the Bush administration as a senior advisor in the State Department and a deputy assistant secretary of defense in the Pentagon. I should share, as full disclosure, Dr. Doran and I actually grew up in the same town, Fullerton, California, but it's actually the first time I've realized that. He received his BA from Stanford and an MA and PhD in Near East Studies from Princeton University. Before joining Hudson, Dr. Doran was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he has held teaching positions at NYU, Princeton, and the University of Central Florida. He appears frequently on television and has published extensively in Foreign Affairs, The American Interest, Commentary, Mosaic, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Just reading these two gentlemen's biographies, I think, could take us the rest of the event, but we'll keep it abridged there. And we're very thankful for their expertise that they've lent us today and also their time. Gentlemen, with your permission, I will jump right into some of the questions so we have as much time as possible. Ilan, the first is for you. The Islamic Republic in Iran has, through its IRGC Quds Force, which Qasem Soleimani famously led before he fell on some hard times earlier this year, established a foothold in several strategic countries in the Middle East. As the United States looks to establish peace in the region, what has been the strategic impact that IRI meddling has had, and what has been the cost of this meddling? And if you couldn't hear the question because of the siren in the background, I apologize.
Yeah, that's good. So first of all, thank you, Cameron, and thank you, Dr. Ganji, and thank you to NUFDI for putting this together. I think it's very timely, and it's always nice to be with you, even if it's not in person. So I think really this is the seminal question, and I would only start by saying that, like the sages say, you have to know the nature of a thing to know what it's capable of. And so the policy debate in Washington, I think, very often skirts that fact when it comes to Iran. It tends to look at Iran as just another country in the Middle East, as sort of an ordinary state actor. But Iran isn't a status quo power. Iran is a revisionist power that seeks to alter the balance of the correlation of forces, the strategic balance in the Middle East and beyond, in its favor and against its adversaries. And here, there's a broad array of adversaries, not only in the United States, not only Israel, but also in the Sunni and Sunni Arab world. And so what Iran has done has been to position itself very deftly over the last decade to realize an ambition that it's had for a long time, right? If you go back to the foundational documents of the Islamic Revolution, not just the formative constitution, of which there have been several iterations since, but the formative constitution that came out in 1979, 1980, but also even before that, to Khomeini's manifesto to Islamic government and sort of the way he thought about building an Islamic Republic in Iran. It was never intended to be contained only within Iran. It was intended as an export commodity, right? This is where that clause of sort of the primacy of exporting the revolution comes from. It's why the formative constitution of the Islamic Republic noted in its preamble that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is intended not just to safeguard the territorial boundaries of Iran, but also to spread the model of successful Shiite Islamic revolution beyond the borders of the country, right? And so, that is unfortunately the necessary frame, but it's also a frame that's overlooked very often here in Washington when policymakers talk about what Iran is doing. There is a temptation, and it's an understandable temptation, to think about Iran as sort of an ordinary country. But I'm a big believer in formative texts. I'm a big believer in understanding strategic culture, and it's very difficult to not think about what Iran has done in the 4 decades since, in terms of expanding its influence, in terms of meddling in the internal affairs of other countries, not only its neighbors, but even beyond in the region. you really need that background ideological context to understand why Iran has done what it wants. Otherwise, you'd be tempted to think that what Iran has been doing is a bug in the system, but it's not a bug in the system. It's actually a feature of the system.
I think your reference to the preamble to Khomeini's comments before he even took power is so critical. And as you say, that it's not a bug; it's part of the software, as it were. Mike, to you, first of all, again, thank you for joining us. You have been a leading voice, as has Ilan, on this matter, and I want to discuss at the beginning here President Trump's strategy vis-a-vis Iran. It has been, or vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic, I should say, it has been described by many as the strongest policy, the most forceful policy against the Islamic Republic that we have seen from any American president in the 41-year existence of this regime. But critics have referred to it, and specifically maximum pressure, as being a set of tactics without a strategy. How would you respond to that? And what's your view of the president's strategy and where we find ourselves today?
Well, thanks. Before I answer, let me just say thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here with Ilan, and it's great to see Dr. Ganji again. And before we get to the question of Iran, let's talk about the really serious stuff. What high school did you go to in Fullerton?
Actually, before after I grew up there, I moved to Corona. So I went to Centennial High School, but I had a bunch of friends from Sunny Hills, so yeah. I know the area well.
Okay, all right. I was afraid you were going to tell me that you went to Servite or Fullerton High, and no. Okay.
We're not that much of rivals. We're okay.
All right. After now talking about high school, I already forgot what the question was. I'm clearly having a senior moment.
The president's strategy, maximum pressure.
Yeah. Oh, it's the remarkable thing about Donald Trump. Nobody's ever accused him of delving really deeply into history or having a lot of tolerance for long policy briefs and so on. But it's my very sincere belief that Donald Trump has understood the fundamentals of the U.S.-Iranian relationship better than any of his predecessors. And there's always been a tendency, Ilan said it very well, there's always been a tendency to think that this is just a normal country. There's something deep in the American character, and it's not a Republican or a Democratic thing. It's an American thing, to believe that we can find the diplomatic formula that will open up the shared interests between Iran and the United States. Because we look at it, if you feed all of the fundamentals into a computer and you get the readout, then all the big brains in Washington look and they see, oh wow, there's a lot of fundamental overlap between Iran's interests and America's interests. Iran wants a stable Iraq, right? And so does America. And Iran wants to defeat ISIS, and so does America. And so if we just show them that we're not really all that hostile to them, we can unlock all this potential. And of course, they're whispering that to us all the time. And their friends are whispering that to us all the time. But I totally agree with Ilan, and they're out to destroy the American system. And they can smell in the American ambivalence about its role in the Middle East, they can smell an opportunity to become the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. So they would like to expel the United States from the Middle East entirely, but they can already see from our retreat from Iraq and the weakness of Iraq that this is a great opportunity for them, despite all of the weakness. That's another mistake the Americans do. They kind of total up all of the military and economic capabilities, and the United States is this huge beast with these unbelievable muscles, and could crush Iran with one finger if it wanted to. And Iran is weak, and it's and getting weaker in many ways. Doesn't have a serious regular military. And we look at that and we say, well, they don't have the capabilities, so they can't have the intentions. And I think they do have the intentions, and they have developed all kinds of capabilities that we have never really answered. effectively, because we want to find the way out of the conflict with them, and we're sure that there is a kind of magic formula, and it just doesn't exist. And Donald Trump understood all that. He understood that we are a superpower and they are not, and that they're basically a bunch of thugs when push comes to shove. And so he has shown a strong desire. On the one hand, I think he does share with his predecessors a desire to find a negotiated solution with Iran. I think he entertains that idea a little more than I'm comfortable with. But he also understands, and this is the key point, this is the key tectonic point that he understands, that the United States is much more powerful, and that Iran is not going to make a deal unless it really understands that. And so what he's done with maximum pressure is he has set the predicate. I think in his mind, it's a predicate for a negotiated settlement, but it's from my point of view, it's a predicate for successful containment of Iran and weakening of it. Now, when people say it's not a strategy, what they're really arguing, without admitting it, is for the Obama strategy. Because what the genius of the Obama strategy, let me actually, in deference to Joe Biden, let me call it the Obama-Biden strategy, right? Because I think it should always be around his neck in the elections, right? The genius of the Obama strategy. Well, actually, let me take a step back. Let me see what was wrong with it. What was wrong with the Obama strategy is exactly what Ilan said, is that it assumed that Iran was a defensive status quo power, and that the major impediment to U.S. Iranian cooperation was American policy. And if we just convinced Iran that we really did want to unlock all of this shared potential through cooperation, then they would come our way. Instead, what happened is they pocketed everything we gave to them and demanded more. And exploited our desire to reach an agreement in order to start proliferating militias around the region and distribute to them precision-guided weaponry. That's what was wrong with it. The genius in the strategy is it sold the American people and European people as well on the idea that there was a glorious end game, and that we were actually at the beginning of the end of the game with Iran. And, you know, just around the corner is going to be peace in the Middle East and cooperation between Iran, Russia, United States, and the EU. So when they turn around and they say to us, those of us who support Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and they say, well, you don't have a strategy, what they're really saying is, you don't have a glorious vision of the end game that's just around the corner, right? And the problem with that argument is it's a con. It's a total con. There is no glorious end game around the corner. We're going to be in a conflict for the reasons that Ilan pointed out. We are going to be in a conflict with Iran until this regime goes away. I can present the beautiful end game. The beautiful end game is this regime goes away and democracy flourishes in Iran. There it is. That's the strategy. When will that happen? I don't know. You know, maybe never. But this is not containment of a nasty, aggressive, disgusting regime. Is not a hard concept to understand. It's been around since the beginning of international relations, and it's a completely legitimate, justifiable position.
Thank you very much, Dr. And I would say that I think that glorious endgame that you described is, I think, the glorious endgame that many of our attendees have today. Certainly, the Iranian people have in mind, and I appreciate you laying that out. I'll make just one note for those watching, because I think Iranians have a lot of sensitivity to this notion of Iran and the Islamic Republic being one and the same. And I think one of the great things about having you two on today is, as academics, as really, you know, strategic leaders in this space in Washington, you two have been among the best that I personally have seen, that I'm sure I can speak for Dr. Ganji as well, in relaying to others in Washington, D.C. that no, Iran, the Iranian people, the Iranian nation, and the Islamic Republic are not one and the same. And so I wanted to thank you for that. I know shorthand we refer to things different ways, but you two have really been, so great about that in Washington. And so I wanted to clarify that for our guests and thank you, because there are too many people in this town who view those two as one and the same when they're not. So your leadership there has been really important for us. And Ilan, I wanted to ask you a question about what you and Mike have both referred to as sort of this innate policy of the Islamic Republic to meddle in the region. I think meddle is, probably the most generous we could be in describing what they're doing. Others would call it crimes against humanity, war crimes. What has been the cost of that meddling from a humanitarian perspective? I think that the word meddling doesn't do it justice, but that's how it's often described here. So what the IRI, what the IRGC are doing in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, Lebanon, what has been the cost of all of that?
Right. Well, so the bill comes due effectively in two ways, right? There's the cost, the opportunity cost. That probably the most important thing to me is the opportunity cost that's been lost for the Iranian people themselves, right? Because part of the lie that Mike started talking about was the fact that the way the deal was sold, the 2015 nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA, the way it was sold to the Iranian people themselves. Because let's be clear, right? Iran is a country of 85 million people. It's not a monolith politically. There's lots of competing opinion in there. And the regime is, by all accounts, very unpopular. So we, as Americans, focus very much on the political salesmanship that was attendant in selling the JCPOA to the American public, and as we should. But there was also a sales pitch that was going on in Iran as well. And the sales pitch in Iran, right, not to put too fine a point on it, had a lot to do with a peace dividend and trickle-down economics, and the fact that, if we de-escalate with the great Satan, then all of a sudden we can turn our resources inward. But none of that materialized, right? And there's a very simple reason for that, because the Iranian regime is expeditionary in nature, and over its 41-year history has consistently preferred guns to butter. So the amount of direct and indirect sanctions relief that Iran received as a result of the JCPOA was not given to the benefit of Iran. It was rather fun. It wasn't infrastructure. It wasn't social services. It wasn't sort of all the things that would actually contribute to the lifeblood of a healthy nation. Instead, what you saw was a recapitalization of Iran's military budget, right? It increased by, I think an order of magnitude. It went from something from like 3% to like 7 or 8% of national GDP over the course of like 18 months. And sort of the Pentagon has really good statistics on this, but it's a pretty striking escalation. But the even more profound escalation was the amount of expeditionary resources that the Iranian regime leveraged and trickled down, not to the Iranian people, but trickled down to Shiite militias in Iraq, or Lebanon's Hezbollah militia, or the Houthi rebels in Yemen, right? And the Iranian expansion of asymmetric leverage as a result of the JCPOA, right? And I think it's intellectual honesty demands that we recognize that the Obama administration was trying to do a tactical thing. It was trying to kick the nuclear can down the road, right? Where we're talking about a 10-year agreement in which is right now coming due, right? We sort of see the UN debate that's taking place right now over the expiration of the UN arms embargo, over the potential for snapback of sanctions. But in truth, the agreement was never intended as an indefinite thing. It was always intended to expire. It was always intended to sunset. It was intended to make Iran's nuclear program and its regional ambitions somebody else's problem, not the Obama administration's problem, right? And it was, by the way, very successful in doing that. But it has also made Iran's growing regional capabilities an issue, because the deal may have been tactical in nature, but the benefits that the regime received were strategic, right? It's what has allowed Iran's expansion throughout the region at the expense of prosperity within Iran, but also at the expense of stability in places like Syria, in places like Iraq, and in Lebanon, and in Yemen, right? So I think, the bill comes due in two ways. There's opportunity costs that are lost for the Iranians themselves, and there's the price of increasing Iranian adventurism that's being paid by the populations of neighboring countries.
For length, I think you really hit the nail on the head, especially in terms of what Iranians are feeling. I think we'll come back to some of the regional aspects as well. Michael, one question for you, something that is dominating the news cycle recently is this UAE-Israel peace deal. And as it has been announced, perhaps other steps coming forward with Sudan, Oman, Saudi Arabia, perhaps with allowing the use of their airspace. In general, sort of in direct opposition to the chaos and the sowing of destruction that Ilan just referred to, that the Islamic Republic is pushing in the region. Other countries, mainly UAE and Israel and others coming forward potentially, are pushing for peace, and they're pushing in the opposite direction. How do you analyze the significance of this deal? Again, critics have said, well, this was pretty much de facto as well. Making it de jure is not a huge deal. What's your view?
Those critics who were saying that, they're the same people who for years said we can't have normalization between Israel and the Arab states until the Israelis make peace with the Palestinians. And so we, the United States, should put all of our efforts into Palestinian-Israeli peace, and everything else should be on hold. Meanwhile, the Palestinians vetoed everything. For them, it was always normalization was the most important goal, but we can't get there without Israeli-Palestinian peace. Now that Trump has shown actually we can get normalization without Israeli-Palestinian peace, they're saying, oh, normalization, what does it matter? We had it already. It's a ridiculous argument. This is a big deal. It's a very, very big deal. What I will say is, though, we don't know how big a deal. One of the most exciting aspects for me is the one that I just alluded to, basically the intellectual one, that Trump has shown us a new paradigm. And the key here to all of this is the Iran policy. That's the linchpin of the entire regional policy, because if I could just build on what I was going to say what Obama said, what Ilan just said, I think his remarks were fantastic. They were very sharp, very clear, very accurate, and I would just add to that a couple of things. In order, in allowing, which is basically what the Obama administration did, opening up that space for Iran to expand across the region, to develop a second Hezbollah basically in Yemen, or a Hezbollah in the making in Yemen, to build up all of those militias in Iraq and in Syria. In order to make that happen and get the nuclear deal at the same time, the Obama administration had to denigrate all of its traditional allies. And three in particular: Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey, because each one of them, each in their own way, they didn't have an identical picture of what was going on, but in their own neighborhood, the policy of accommodating Iran and Russia was deeply troubling to each one of those actors. And when they started to complain to Washington, they had to be put in their place. And so, with Saudi Arabia, it was the lack of democracy in Saudi Arabia, its adventurism in Yemen, and so on. With Israel, it was settlements. With Turkey, it was relations with the Kurds, and so on, or supposed support for ISIS in Turkey. And different constituencies in Washington grabbed hold of some of those arguments. And continue with it down to this day. It's not just the Democratic Party. You have different elements within the career bureaucracy who supported some of those critiques of our allies, and so our allies got degraded. What Trump did is with the Iran policy is he showed our allies that he's going back to the concept of the United States as a leader of a coalition against Iran. And that has created a space for much greater, I think, cooperation, trust, and understanding between the United States and them. At the same time, the U.S. under Trump is still sending a message to the region of ambivalence about the American role and about the staying power. I mean, the Saudis particularly felt that after the attack by Iran on the Abqaiq facility. And the lack of an American response. And there was a lot of restraint on the part of Trump that caused worry in the among the Saudis. Restraint with regard to the tankers, restraint with regard to the downing of the American drone. Now, Trump won back a lot of good feeling, I think, when he approved the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which, by the way, no previous president would have done. I think we know that. When I was in the White House, I know of three, or when I was in the, I should say, when in the Bush administration, I know of 3 moments when we literally had Qasem Soleimani in our crosshairs and we didn't pull the trigger. So I assume that there were many others that I don't that I don't know about, just given the nature of his activities. So that's another thing for which Donald Trump gets, I think, should get an enormous amount of credit for. But still, even with the killing of Soleimani, there's still that doubt, and that's one of the factors leading the UAE and Israel to band together. From the UAE point of view, it has the advantage of creating of sending, simultaneously through Israel, but also from Abu Dhabi, the same strategic picture to Washington. So there, I mean, one way to think of this is that this is a block of states that are getting together in order to influence the United States in a certain direction. But at the same time, they're also coming together in order to be more effective in their cooperation on the ground in the absence, to kind of fill the vacuum of retreating American power to a certain extent. So kind of two things going on simultaneously: vectoring Washington in the way that they want, but also filling in the space for where Washington has stepped back. And Saudi Arabia is sort of the silent partner in all this. The body language of Saudi Arabia is very positive, but it's clear that it's the UAE that's out front on it. Now, one of the interesting dimensions, especially coming out of the UAE, but also supported to a certain extent by Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't say to a certain extent, to a significant extent, is the attack on what I might call resistance culture of the Islamic Republic and of Hezbollah. There's this whole resistance alliance, and there's a whole set of principles about resisting Israel, resisting the West, that goes along with that. And the UAE in particular is taking that cultural dimension of the fight very seriously. And there's a whole, I mean, this isn't just a simple strategic alignment between Israel and the UAE. There's a whole cultural dimension to it, an attack on resistance culture that's very interesting and very, very positive. Now, the Israelis are talking mainly when they look at this about the the impact that it's had on eliminating the Palestinian veto, which was a great, which was a supporter of resistance culture. I mean, it was a factor working in the favor of resistance culture because it kept Israel, one step removed from the regional mix. So they're also talking about the economic potential because of the compatibility of the UAE's economy and Israel's. What hasn't gotten much attention and deserves more is the military potential of a UAE-Israel alignment and directed at Iran. Now, we have to wait and see. It may be that that military potential will remain unrealized. I don't know. I don't have any information about it. But it's one of the most interesting unknowns about this agreement. Will it develop into any kind of concrete operational cooperation between the UAE and Israel? If you ask me right off the bat, I'd say I'm a little doubtful about that. But I will also have to admit that I do not know. It is exactly what I said, an interesting unknown. It's got to be the thing, if you're sitting in Tehran, that is most worrying about this. You know, they don't think that the schools in Lebanon are going to start using UAE curriculum to destroy, Hezbollah's position in Lebanon and everything. But cooperation, military cooperation between the two, has got to be a worry. And of course, the Iranians came out and threatened the UAE immediately. Veiled in the form of veiled threats. And I assume that it's the military cooperation they're concerned about. Now, in the case of the UAE, unfortunately, from my point of view, I think that the UAE these days is regarding Turkey as a greater threat to the UAE than Iran. But I don't think that's the case with the Israelis. But part of the strategic picture the UAE wants to send to Washington is that there are two threats, Iran and Turkey. I don't agree with that interpretation at all. But so we're going to have to wait and see how that all develops over time.
That was an excellent coverage of this deal in the words of, well, the paraphrased words of one particular presidential candidate this year. It's a big freaking deal. I think that we can agree on that. Ilan, this is such a big topic. I want to give you a chance to hop in on here as well. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, no, and if anything, I think Mike is underselling the case, right? Because for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I think that, listen, we're politically in the silly season. American politics are less intelligent today than they have been in the past, I would argue. And we're seeing this every day, right? Because we're all on Twitter and we sort of see the nonsense that goes on there. But there is the conventional wisdom that says that two things. One, that Trump doesn't have a Middle East strategy. And the second, that the tactical things that he is doing in the region, like maximum pressure, are not working, right? And that has become the political narrative that has sort of animated the run up to the election in November. But both of those things are empirically wrong, right? So on the maximum pressure front, if you look at empirical data, everything from Iran's oil exports, the volume of Iran's oil exports, to their foreign exchange reserves, to sort of the revival of protests within the country in response to worsening economic conditions, it's clear that maximum pressure is having an effect, a material effect. Now, opponents of maximum pressure may not like that it's having that effect, but I think objectively, intellectual honesty demands that we say, that it is working, right? We can have questions about where this is headed. And this is where the second part comes in, I think, because we tend to think about maximum pressure in isolation. And so we're sort of caught flat-footed when things happen, like the Israel-UAE deal that we weren't expecting. But the reality is that the Trump administration all along has been articulating a very ambitious Middle East policy. And by the way, a Middle East policy, they still may not succeed. Let's be clear, right? I mean, it could sort of go off the rails. It's still in the early days, but it has at least three parts, right? On the one hand, you have maximum pressure against Iran, right? Which is, I think, sort of a very durable plank of the policy. On the other, at the other extreme, you have the deal of the century for Israeli-Palestinian peace, which was unveiled back in January at the White House. The Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Omanis were present at the unveiling ceremony. They have been stakeholders all along, but this wouldn't, as Mike said, this wouldn't have been possible if the Saudis weren't giving a nod in the background, right? So this is sort of and by the way, let's be clear, right? It's a deal that is favorable in strategic terms to Israel, but it's also favorable, and we don't hear much about this, to the Palestinians. The peace deal, and it's like 82 pages, you can find it online on the White House website, it's not a secret, talks about something on the order of $50 billion in targeted US foreign direct investment in the Palestinian territories if the Palestinians come to the table, right? By way of sort of scaling, this is 3 times the annual GDP of the Palestinian Authority, right? So you're talking about a massive infusion of cash. And the Palestinians haven't come to the table yet, but the Arab states that have supported the deal of the century have supported the deal of the century because they understand that there is an opportunity here. But between those two poles, between maximum pressure on the one hand and the deal of the century on the other, there's something in the middle. And this is what we saw earlier this month, or last month, right? Because we're in September, with the signing of the Israel-UAE deal. And that's something that, frankly, is enormously significant, but most people haven't heard about. And it's something called the Middle East Security Alliance. The Trump administration has, since 2017, tried to build a, what has been reported in the press as an Arab NATO, right? It's actually much more than that, because it's not just a military bloc, it's also an economic bloc. It involves energy policy coordination, but it's also enormously ambitious because the idea here is not to sort of lash the GCC countries together to deter Iran. It's also to bring in other players like Morocco, like Israel, like Jordan, into a deterrence coalition of exactly the type that Mike was talking about. So when I saw the news of the Israel-UAE deal, to me, it was an affirmation of Israel's quiet diplomacy, right? The track to diplomacy that's gone on with the Arab states over the last decade over Iran. But it's also, to me, a confirmation that this middle plank of the Trump administration strategy is actually gaining traction. It's actually gaining momentum. And frankly, that's a very big deal.
In your descriptions of this deal, which were fantastic, thank you so much. You mentioned, I think, the power players of the Middle East, and this, the Israelis, the Emiratis, the Omanis, the Moroccans, the Turks, everyone really is sort of at the table. What's missing, at least on this side of the table, is Iran, of course. And I think that has been to the chagrin of the Iranian people. One thing I've seen consistently in sort of analyzing Persian language social media recently, as we're speaking to people inside Iran, they compare their, if you will, seat at the table now, which is really a table quite far away, and the table that everyone is pointing at, to the seat at the table that they had pre-1979, when it would have been nearly impossible for any significant diplomatic achievement to be reached in the Middle East without Iran playing a role. I think previously it's been increasingly today documented how significant a role the Shah played and Iran played as a whole in bringing people together, whether it was his role in bringing the Egyptians and the Israelis together, or maintaining some sort of balance with Iraq. And Iran played a pivotal role. And so Iranians, my assessment is they feel quite left out, and they are looking up at their leaders and saying, it's because of you that the region is uniting against us, as opposed to the region uniting as a whole and us playing a constructive role in that unity. So to you, Ilan, I want to ask, what do you think? We've seen protests in Iran over the past 3 years, significant. We've seen sort of social media reaction to this deal, feeling left out, which is not unlike other deals that the regime has signed with China and Russia recently. What is your view of this, of the Iranian reaction, the domestic reaction, and how significant has that been?
Right, and this is, I think, something that where you really see the disconnect between what's actually happening in Iran today and the way what's happening in Iran is being perceived in Washington, right? Because in Washington, you still have, and you hear this all the time on TV, sort of you read it in the press, this ephemeral struggle between moderates and hardliners, right? And so we shouldn't do anything to empower the hardliners. And President Trump is doing all the wrong things, and it's making the Iranian regime more and more extreme, right? Case in point, right? There are articles in Foreign Affairs this week, sort of on this precise point. But I think that really misses the point, right? To me, as somebody, I spend a lot of time looking at human terrain, at sort of, the sort of socio-cultural indicators. To me, this cake was baked a long time ago already, because the protests that have been taking place, right? And let's be clear, the protests that are taking place today are a continuum from what started in December of 2017. Those protests, the ones that have been taking place with interruption, but fairly consistently since then, are a fundamental repudiation of the regime on a whole bunch of grounds, right? So you could argue that the Green Movement back in 2009 was more of an elitist movement, more centered on urban elites, didn't activate certain strata of Iranian society. I mean, they were very flashy, they were very showy, but they didn't really have staying power. And what you see now is a protest wave that is still incoherent, but it's very clear that it's more fundamental in terms of being a rejection of the existing status quo. And I think that's hugely significant because the Iranian regime bought itself some time, or it had time bought for it with the outbreak of the global coronavirus pandemic, right? Because the Iranian regime controls the street, they control the levers of power, they can enforce lockdowns, they can prevent people from organizing, but the underlying dissatisfaction of Iranians with socioeconomic conditions, with the political trajectory of the country, I mean, that's still there. And that's why, as economic conditions worsen, as part of the effects of maximum pressure, you're seeing the Iranian people come out in the street again, because the underlying conditions, the underlying dissatisfaction, the failure to thrive that has been present over the last 4 decades of clerical rule is, I think, sort of an edifying feature of the Islamic Republic, right? The Islamic Republic cares much more about ideology and outward adventurism than it does about domestic prosperity, right? And the Iranian population has figured that out very well. The people that haven't figured that out very well, unfortunately, are American policymakers, right? Because that's a fundamental shift in the discussion about what Iran needs. It's a question about, what do ordinary Iranians want? What kind of system would be good for the region and for them, right? And we're not having that debate as of yet. And frankly, the sooner we do, the better.
I want to be respectful of both of your time, and we have received dozens of questions. I'll make this my last question, and I'll give you each a chance to answer it. Dr. Doran, I'll start with you. The meat of this discussion, the bulk of this discussion, especially based on each of your expert opinion, has been just how destructive a role the Islamic Republic has played in terms of, when the region is coming together in many forms to celebrate peace. With this recent deal between Israel and the UAE, the supreme leader calls it stabbing Muslims in the back, stabbing Palestinians in the back. When the region is trying to fight ISIS, IRI is keeping Bashar Assad in Syria and massacring hundreds of thousands of Syrians. And wherever one turns, as each of you have alluded to today, the hand of this regime is in play, and it's making things worse, I would argue. With that said, I know that President Trump's policy has been a significant departure from those of previous presidents, but at the end of the day, as you referred to in your comments, it still sort of boils down to, or still is focused on, at least as we've been told by the president and the Secretary of State, to bringing this regime back to the negotiating table. And so for those who view it, as you put it, the glorious end game of having a free democratic Iran, why, despite all of this meddling, all of these crimes, if you will, why is U.S. policy focused solely on engaging this regime and not looking to alternatives?
Well, I think that's because of the experience of the Iraq War. And you look now at the polling, and last poll I saw, this is some time ago, but 65% or so of the American public think that the Iraq War was a big mistake. And interestingly, in that same poll that I saw, about the same number of soldiers who served in the military in the Iraq War think the same thing. Trump had a very, I think, disciplined message in 2016. And that was that the American elite is out of touch with the people. It's carrying out policies in foreign policy that don't reflect the national interest and the national will. One of those clearly was the attempt to transform, democratize the Middle East. Regime change in Iraq, I think, has become synonymous for critics with that kind of irresponsible adventurism. And Trump clearly sees it that way. Trump also sees himself as a deal maker. I mean, he likes the idea it's part of his personal brand. He wants to be seen to be negotiating with the Iranians. From his point of view, I think politically, being seen to negotiate with them and failing is almost as good as negotiating with them and getting a deal, because it just shows that he's trying to, putting forth a good faith effort to cut a deal, and that making a deal is what he wants to do. I don't see that changing, and I wouldn't personally. I wouldn't recommend changing it because I'm very much aware on the Republican side, where I live most of the time, is the debate is between, I call it the Pompeo wing of the party and the Rand Paul Tucker Carlson wing. And the Rand Paul Tucker Carlson wing, looks a lot like Bernie Sanders when it comes to the Iran question. And they really want, a lot of them, I think, would like to just get the United States out of the Middle East completely. I think that that would be a very, very big mistake. So within those parameters, I think that what we've got from the Trump administration is absolutely the best that we can expect. And I think we've gotten a lot. A great amount. I have to say that when this all started, I could not have imagined the policy that is developed. When I saw them going for maximum pressure over military pressure, when I say military pressure, I mean hitting the militias hard in Iraq and in Syria and so forth. I didn't imagine that it could become as formidable a policy as it has become. And so I really have to give them credit for seeing that and for bringing it to fruition. I think if you want democracy in Iraq, you're probably going to have to do that through not through American governmental action. American policy can set a context that makes that much more possible, but I don't think that Donald Trump is going to be the guy who's going to do that. It's going to make him nervous because it's going to make his his constituency nervous. And I think what's exciting about the Trump policy, or the thing that we should cherish the most, is that he has come up with a policy that his own base supports. I mean, I saw it clearly with the Qasem Soleimani killing. Trump's base was with him on that. A lot of the more ideological restraintists, let's call them, in the Republican sphere, they were against it. A clear divide opened up between, I'd call it Trump's Jacksonian base and the restraintists. And that is gold, actually, that Donald Trump has found the place for an engaged American policy, an aggressive American policy, but one that doesn't make his base nervous about a big boondoggle to remake the whole world.
Well, I'll push a little bit further on that once I get to some audience questions, as there are several. But Ilan, I'll give you the floor to answer that same question.
Sure. No, I think Mike addressed it very well. I would add 2 points here. First of all, look, speaking only for myself personally, I think a new Iran deal is a suboptimal outcome, because by its nature, it won't capture all of the sort of the desires and the aspirations of the Iranian people. But I do think the way that negotiation takes place, if it does take place, is going to make a lot of difference. What's in that deal is going to make a lot of difference, right? You could end up, or we could end up, at a situation where a weakened Iran, an Iran that is forced to come to the negotiating table because it's fundamentally unstable, is forced to accept a great number of the 12 demands that the Secretary of State laid out at the Heritage Foundation a couple of years ago, and would become less bad, right? It wouldn't become good, but it would become less bad. Is that the optimal scenario? No, probably not. But is that much more livable than the situation we have now? right? From an American perspective, absolutely. And I would argue probably from an Iranian perspective also, right? So that's the first point. Second point, and here I apologize in advance for flogging my work mercilessly. I actually have a book coming out on this issue in October. It's called The Fight for Iran. It's all about opposition politics, because I actually think a great deal of the answer to your question lies in opposition politics themselves, right? So the Iranian opposition wave, right, such as it is, right, implicates personalities and politics, but it's very much, at least for now, it's very much fragmented. There's not a common vision to move forward. And ultimately, when you think about American policy towards Iran, you have to understand Americans can't be more Iranian than Iranians, right? They can't have a clearer vision of what the country should look like than Iranians themselves do, right? So I think the onus here is on organization among the community. It's on organization among activists. It's on hammering out. And I understand, right, that passions are high, tempers flare, completely understand all of it. But it should be possible to come up with a set of orienting principles that unify a significant portion of the Iranian opposition in a way that then can be shopped to the United States as, here is our modus vivendi. Here's the way that we can move forward, right? And my sense is that may be among the most constructive things that those of us that are interested in a more pluralistic future for Iran can push for. Because as Mike said, ultimately, right, this is a heavy lift, and it's not a lift that the United States is going to do instead of the Iranian people. And so sort of those two things advisably.
Can I just throw in one more point here?
Please.
I may be restating what Ilan just said. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to make clear that when I was saying that Trump is a deal maker, I don't think that in my view the deal that Donald Trump could accept from Iran is by definition a deal that is going to diminish the Islamic Republic significantly at home and abroad. And I don't believe that they will actually agree to that deal unless the maximum pressure takes them to such a point that they conclude that the survival of the regime is really absolutely at stake, and they'll try to do it first. If he's reelected in November, then they'll try to wait him out if they can. They'll try techniques of maybe getting negotiating and then getting benefits of negotiation, but they'll still try to buy time like they always do. I don't think that they can cut a deal with him without being really, really seriously diminished.
I think because that answered a few questions. We had several questions from the audience of what would a deal with Trump term 2 look like. So I'm glad you added that. I want to ask a few briefly, and we'll end soon because I know we're coming up on time here. Mike, to you, Ilan mentioned in his last remarks this fragmentation of the opposition, which is no secret to any of us on this call, to the Iranians, to others. And Ilan, your point is well taken. We'll work on it and we'll come back to it. I think that in the coming weeks and months you'll see more and more, because the Iranian people, I think, demand it, and I think there have been those forces. Both of you, who I know, have spoken to, and know Prince Reza Pahlavi, who've been pushing, unity, and that message. I think more are uniting around that message. I would ask this to you, Ilan, if the situation, to you, Mike, if the situation that Ilan described comes to fruition, where you do see in a tangible way this increase in unity of the opposition forces, those to the Islamic Republic, and they were to come to foreign powers, my view is some of the things that they would ask for would be, in fact, all the things they would ask for would be contrary to what is in the American imagination, and for valid reason, of regime change. As you alluded to, Iraq war, military conflict or military engagement would not be on the table. Some of the things I think they would be looking for would be, for example, the support of striking workers, a strike fund, a reinvigorated voice of America, just a dialogue with the opposition, So if we were to get that precondition that Ilan laid out of more unity, do you think that those requests or those things that the officer would be looking for would be amenable, as opposed to what you refer to as this view that it currently has of, basically conjuring up images of the Iraq War?
Yes, I do, for sure. But the way you and Ilan have presented it, I think is the key, is that it can't look like it's the United States going and putting this all together. I think a great example of what you're suggesting is what we've seen in Hong Kong. Is that it's a lot easier for American officials in an administration that is ambivalent, to say the least, even hostile to the idea of aggressive democracy promotion. They're still Americans, right? When Americans see freedom-loving people being stomped on by aggressive regimes, their sympathies naturally go to the freedom-loving people. So the kinds of things that you're describing seem to me to be absolutely within the realm of the possible. But it's a mistake to go ask the United States to the Trump. I think it's not a winning proposition to go to the Trump administration and ask them to put it together.
Absolutely right. I will attempt to combine several questions into one and make this the last one for you, because I think these two do overlap. We received several questions on a potential Biden administration, and also on what we're currently seeing the discussions in the United Nations, which each of you referred to, specifically the European role, and the fact that overall, whether it was during JCPOA and certainly during the Trump administration, you've seen European countries align themselves much more closely with the Islamic Republic than with the United States, and certainly with the Iranian people. I'm sure you've seen this. I see this. I hear this a lot from people inside Iran, that they're gobsmacked, that they cannot believe that the EU would send representatives to Iran, wearing, for example, the forced hijab. I mean, they view it as a slap in the face. I mean, the fact that they welcome Javad Zarif as if he were some legitimate democratically elected representative, as opposed to a vicious killer or the representative of a vicious government. So connecting the two, the Biden policy, what might that look like? And Europeans, why have they taken the regime side, and what do you see from the Europeans going forward? Ilan, I'll shoot it to you first there.
Well, that's a lot, right? So let me try to unpack it as much as I can. So my sense is there's three things here. First of all is sort of the battlefield where the effort to contain Iran currently is, which is the United Nations. Right. So this is sort of the discussion over snapback. This is the discussion over, and the Europeans play a huge part in this, very unsurprisingly, as I'll explain in a second. The Trump administration has made what objectively should be a completely uncontroversial argument, which is that Iran, when it has more weapons, is more of a threat to the region. So Iran shouldn't have access to more weapons. Right? That is the context of the appeal that the Secretary of State and his point man on Iran, which until 2 days ago was Brian Hook, were making at sort of various fora into international audiences in the run-up to passing or submitting a resolution to extend the arms embargo, right? Because the arms embargo by itself will expire in mid-October. That resolution didn't pass. It didn't pass because the Europeans opposed it, because quite frankly, Europe has taken a huge financial hit as a result of maximum pressure. I've seen European estimates that suggest that the continent has cumulatively has lost something like $50 billion in trade with Iran, which is, that is not small change, right? That is a big deal. And the Europeans are interested in an environment. They have a much more sanguine view of Iran and Iran's threat, and they are interested in an environment that's more permissive. But the real culprits here are Russia and China, because Russia and China are in the top 5, with the United States, in the top 5 global arms exporters in the world. And Russia and China, because they're strategic partners of Iran, they understand that once the arms embargo goes away, they will be in the prime position to exploit Iran's quest to rearm and the regime's efforts at military modernization and expansion, right? So the real context here isn't the political tussle, although, because it's, as we say, the silly season, everything is political. But what this is really a conversation about is whether or not people are detached enough to believe that the Iranian regime somehow, against all available evidence in the last half decade, has become a constructive stakeholder in regional politics. I would suggest that the evidence indicates exactly the opposite, right? And this gets us to the third point, which is Biden policy. Look, I think a second Trump term, if the president perseveres in November, is liable to lead to an acceleration of maximum pressure, right? And expansion, because I think maximum pressure is a misnomer because frankly, there's a lot more that we can do, right? Everything ranging from human rights sanctions to an electronic embargo. I mean, there's tons of things that we can do, and there's tons of things that folks in the administration are thinking about. To what end is a different question, right? Is this to pressure Iran to come to the negotiating table, or to foment regime collapse, or whatever it is, right? I mean, that's a discussion that frankly needs to be had in Washington. But it's quite clear that Trump can do more. But if there is a first Biden term that comes about starting in January of next year, I think you're going to see a fundamental reorientation of Iran policy, right? Iran policy is at a crossroads because Vice President Biden is a stakeholder in the 2015 JCPOA. He has signaled that he is prepared to go back to the confines of the 2015 deal, and his advisors have essentially mapped out a blueprint for what they call re-engagement with Iran. If you don't believe me, you can go read it, because a lot of his advisors happen to reside at a center-left, mostly left, not center, think tank in Washington called the Center for New American Security. And they released 2 weeks ago a blueprint for re-engagement with Iran, right? So for everybody watching American politics, but also for the Iranian regime itself, they have a pretty good sense of what is likely to come in a first Biden term, right? So look, advisedly, foreign policy never ranks very high on the voting priorities when people go to the polls. I understand that, right? Mike and I are it's only overridingly important to us. But in the context of this second tier or third tier issue, Iran matters a lot, right? The clearest difference between a second Trump term and a first Biden term is likely to come about in Middle East policy.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned Russia and China, because that hit on several questions we had as well. Dr. Doran, the floor is yours for that same question.
So I agree with everything that Ilan said. I would just add that there's a psychological need on the part of both Democrats and Europeans to see the JCPOA as a great success and to see maximum pressure as a failure. And that's because both of them think that they developed in the JCPOA an alternative to the failed approach of the past. And that's more than just a policy question. It's one of the self-understanding. When you talk to the Europeans, it becomes very clear that they regarded the JCPOA. My understanding of the JCPOA is Obama decided he wanted it. He presented the April election in 2013 of Rouhani as some kind of watershed moment that made it all possible. What made it all possible was Obama's decision that he wanted it, and then he went for it, and he told the Europeans he was going for it, and he didn't even really include them into the negotiations until the very end. That's not how the Europeans see it. The Europeans, they think it's a European initiative. It wasn't the P5+1, it was the EU 3+3. It dates back to 2003, and the Europeans taught the Americans how to do diplomacy. The cowboy Americans who are too inclined to use military force, they showed them how to be nuanced and how to create win-win, diplomatic opportunities with nasty powers like Iran. There is a deep desire on the part of the Europeans to be a third, a third pole in the world between Russia, China, U.S., and then the EU. It's important to them to distinguish themselves from the United States, but the thing is they don't have any military power, so they can't. When they have to distinguish themselves in these sort of cultural, symbolic diplomacy arena, and the two areas in which they can really distinguish themselves the most are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Iran question. So it's deeply wrapped up in their notion that they have an alternative way of going about international relations. And this is really deep with the Europeans. I mean, I put it on a kind of simplistic dime store psychologist, but it's really deep. When you go to, there's a museum of the Cold War in Berlin I went to, and it's a real eye opener for an American because Ronald Reagan is very small in the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War begins with Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, and engagement, engagement diplomacy, breaking down barriers. This is the whole mindset. I mean, it's obviously particularly deep with the Germans. That's one of the things that Obama did is he elevated the Germans to be the primary interlocutors with the United States about Iran. And the same is true of the Democrats. I mean, you go back to the soft power notion. To me, it's ludicrous that soft power, smart power, our soft power assets are what the Middle Easterners really want from us. It's wrong. The Middle East is the cockpit of power politics in the world. What Middle Easterners want from the United States more than anything is security guarantee. That's the name of the game. But the Obama administration didn't see it that way, and Obama had a kind of German worldview. And it's deeply part of the democratic understanding of who they are. The countries that are pushing the security dimension of the American role, the Israelis, the Saudis, and so on. Those have been downgraded significantly in the democratic view, and it's particularly true because of the rise of the progressive left. The Bernie Sanders. Biden is the responsible face of a Democratic Party in which the most dynamic element is the progressive left. And the progressive left likes the JCPOA, wants to cut a deal with Iran, wants to pull the United States out of the Middle East significantly, doesn't like Israel, doesn't like Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. So, I don't see Biden. I agree with Ilan that the CNAS document shows us the intentions of the advisors around Biden. What it doesn't show us is the extent to which they are going to be beholden, or they're going to have to come up with policies they're going to pass muster with their leftist constituency, which is on the rise in the party.
This was fascinating. I'll just give you a brief anecdote. Normally, in these sort of events, as I'm sure you all have moderated, you will have noticed, as time goes on, you get closer to the end, you see the participants drop off on all platforms. I have not seen that. In fact, I think we're getting more people here at the end, which is a tribute to the excellent content that you all provided us. I wish we could keep you for several more hours, but you have many things to attend to. I'd just like to thank you once again for the time you've given us today. I mean, it was fascinating. I'm sure our attendees learned a lot. I learned a significant amount myself. Your insights were fascinating, as they always are. And I'd just like to more broadly thank you for each of your leadership on this issue. As I said, in a town that does not often take seriously, the non-IRI forces in Iran, each of you has done so in very many ways. And I know, as I'm sure you also heard from others, that it is immensely appreciated by Iranians, by the people at home who see the content that you put out and pay attention to the engagements that you all have. So, your leadership on this issue from an academic perspective and from the work that you do is really second to none, and it's most appreciated. I would urge our attendees to follow each of these gentlemen on Twitter in the picture we had for this. You can find them there. Great content from each of them. Mike is partial to sharing some very funny videos as well, so you can get that entertainment as well. And I would just say thank you. Buy Ilan's book when it comes out, and Dr. Doran's next one if it does come out as well, whenever that may be.
Can I flack my latest article, or my latest article -1 actually, which is pinned on my Twitter feed. It's called China's Emerging Middle Eastern Kingdom, and it treats in great detail the China-Iran connection, and that's in Tablet magazine. Thanks.
What we'll do is, as a follow-up to this event, to our attendees, we'll share that. We'll share both of your Twitter, so all your future events are also available. Again, thank you so much for your time. It was a true pleasure for us to host you, and we hope to have the pleasure of hosting you again, and God willing, as soon as possible, in some in-person events as well, not just on Zoom.
Thanks, Cameron. This is great.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.